Hey, this is Stu, and of course I'm at the beautiful Purple Valley, and this time I'm here with Ty Landrum, first visit to Purple Valley, and we understand you coming from quite a formal philosophy background, so we thought we're going to try and make the most of that. Unfortunately, we're on dodgy ground because I'm interviewing and my philosophy is like, so Ty is going to lead the way, I imagine, most of the time. But you were giving some afternoon workshops based around the Shiva Shakti story, or one of the stories. So can you first, we'll use that as our vehicle for exploring further, maybe to start with.
Sure.
So perhaps you can give a précis of what it was you were sort of, why you were doing that and where you were coming from.
So those stories are very interesting to me because you can sort of contemplate them as a metaphor for Hatha Yoga practice. So Shiva and Shakti, I mean, you know, in the simplest terms, we can understand Shiva and Shakti as representing pure consciousness, which is Shiva, and the sort of nature, the creative principle, the principle of manifest reality. So the principle that expresses itself in the phenomenal world, sort of as we know it through the senses, which is including also everything that we immediately encounter in experience. And they have this sort of very volatile, dynamic, sometimes tragic love affair. Yeah. And so their struggles with each other sort of highlight, you know, important dimensions of the sort of lived experience of being human.
Because that's what we were saying, wasn't it? The stories are nice, but it's how we can take these things into their everyday life, isn't it?
Yeah.
And so, as you say, it's part of the living yoga practice in a fuller sense of just the asana as well, yeah?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, mythology is, you know, the purpose of mythology isn't really to give a literal description of something. It's not to sort of, to merely, you know, to give a metaphor for a particular, you know, philosophical outlook that, and you know, that like makes it more palatable by telling a story. It can sometimes do that, but mythology is more interesting than that because it asks us to sort of engage with the meanings of the things that, the meaning of the story itself, and the elements of the story can have, can represent things on a number of different registers, on a number of different levels, you know? So, I mean, you know, Shiva also represents the masculine principle in some sense. Shakti represents the feminine principle. So in contemplating their dynamic, we're also contemplating gender relations, yeah? And we can also sort of contemplate different social and political phenomena insofar as those things are informed by gender relations, and while at the same time sort of contemplating, you know, the meaning of yoga practice and the experience of falling in love and the experience of being, you know, drawn toward religious ritual and kind of and then it's a sort of exercise in trying to understand how all of those things fit together. So mythology pulls you into that, and I think of that as a sort of yoga practice in itself, to contemplate those interrelationships.
And do you feel that the mythology, the stories themselves, are trying to guide you towards a certain path, or are they just a vehicle for contemplation?
I think they're more than a vehicle. They're more than just a vehicle for contemplation, but they are not necessarily trying to sort of draw you toward any particular sort of thesis about the way reality is, or something like that.
Right.
You know, there's this very beautiful sort of absence of dogmatism, and they sort of destabilize your attempts to sort of grasp too tightly to the meanings of the stories, because they can be so easily interpreted in other ways. And that's nice. That's something that, theoretical philosophy as we know it, modern Western theoretical philosophy, is very different in that sense. There's sort of that kind of philosophy places a much higher value on clarity and literalism and things like that.
And so the sort of challenges that we sort of face as yoga practitioners, and drawing from those stories as far as trying to live a way that is sensible, and then take it into real life situations. How can we draw from those stories? What's the sorts of things that you feel that we maybe should be challenging our existing preconceptions maybe, or stereotypical ideas?
Yeah. So, in a broad sense, there's a particular idea of what Hatha Yoga practice is all about that I think is pretty clearly reflected in these myths. And this is the idea that that Hatha Yoga is fundamentally about exploring the intimate interrelationship between consciousness and the body, consciousness and embodied experience, sensation. And that, that interrelationship is allegorized as this sort of drama between Shiva and Shakti, where they sort of move toward each other and then they sort of pull back, and Shiva has this tendency towards self-enclosure. He can go and sit in meditation for years, even centuries, eons on end, and sort of forget himself. And so Shakti's job is to sort of incarnate and pull him out of himself into creative involvement with the world, so that he can start to actually become self-aware through his engagements with other beings. Yeah? And so but what does Shakti and Shiva do fundamentally in their relationship? Well, when they're together, when Shiva recognizes Shakti as Shakti in one of her embodiments, they mostly spend their time in sexual intimacy.
Excellent.
Yeah.
And my sort of philosophy.
Yeah. And their intimacy is a metaphor for the state of yoga practice itself, in which and their intimacy is always, it's represented as, we're invited to think of it as being completely devoid of any egocentric agenda. Okay? So they, for instance, when Sati and Shiva first unite, and he takes Sati to his mountaintop abode, and so away from her father, they spend, according to the story, 25 years, in sexual revelry. And during that 25-year period, and even at the end of it, there's no sort of moment of climax that brings it to an end. It's their lovemaking. It doesn't have those kinds of climactic moments as something that it's directed toward, or something that brings it to an end. And that's supposed to symbolize the absence of any egocentric longing, of any selfish desire. In other words, it symbolizes the absence on the part of both Shiva and Shakti of any desire to have a particular experience for themselves that would bring this thing to its logical conclusion. Right? The idea is that their intimacy is perfect in every moment when they're sort of completely open to each other. So Shiva is capable of being the lover of Shakti because Shiva represents pure consciousness, which is to say consciousness that's completely free of any egocentric center. So Shiva's sometimes called Dayalu, or the compassionate one, because he embraces all beings. He embraces every phenomenon that reveals itself in this space of his consciousness with sort of perfect detachment, but also sort of adoration and equanimity. So he has a sort of selfless love for everything that he encounters. Yeah? And so he's completely open to Shakti, however she might be.
Right.
Right?
And that's a nice principle as a starter.
That's a nice principle as a starter. It's also precisely, I think, the kind of consciousness that we're trying to cultivate in yoga practice. So in yoga, so our sensory experiences are always infinitely richer than anything that we can comprehend with our ideas about what we're experiencing. And Hatha Yoga practice, as I understand it, works with a sort of balance of prana and apana, for example, a balance of breath that helps us suspend those conceptual impositions that we put on our experience that filter them and limit them and confine them to something that makes sense. So when we're able to sort of suspend those conceptual impositions, we suddenly open ourselves to an excessive, overabundant, overwhelming profusion of sensation. And that's Shakti. That's what Shakti is. She's the creative principle in all of its sort of irreducible excess. So she represents, not only the sort of bottomless well of sensation that is the body, but also this sort of infinitely sort of mutating and so infinitely sort of not quite graspable principle of the natural world that science is always sort of constantly sort of trying to grasp a hold of, but then having to constantly sort of shift its ideas and reshape its categories. When you think of biology, for example, in biology, an attempt to sort of botanize all of the different forms of life, right, is that process is always having to be revised in the face of the fact that its subject is constantly changing in unpredictable ways. Mm-hmm. That the natural world is subject to genetic mutation, and without genetic mutation, life itself couldn't exist. So that sort of excess and that ability to mutate and to be something other than nature just was is sort of part of the very essence of the thing. Yeah? And so in the context of Hatha Yoga, we're sort of working with the balancing of these sort of polar elements of our experience in order to suspend the limitations that we place on our experience through our concepts, so that we can open ourselves to what's excessive and surprising and perhaps also threatening to our sense of who we are and what we're experiencing. And it is inherently threatening to do that, because the ego, of course, the role of the ego is to sort of to try and make sense of this overwhelming mass of sensation and experience by relating it to a particular idea of what we are, mm-hmm. that has to limit itself to certain memories, certain experiences, certain sensations, certain beliefs, certain emotions. It can't countenance everything that the body actually feels, because then it couldn't have a cohesive idea of itself.
Yeah.
Yeah. So when we the yoga practice is sort of teaching us to to sort of have a different relationship to that ego function. We're not trying to destroy the ego function, because the ego function is an essential piece of our sanity and of our integrity as human beings. That we can make sense of our experience and tell cohesive stories about ourselves. But it's also at the same time trying to teach us how to open ourselves to our shadow sides, so that we can also see the various ways in which the things that we don't acknowledge are informing our experience and impacting us, and often unconscious and hidden, but often very dramatic ways, so that we can sort of so that we can be aware of that and perhaps even integrate some of that, but also just for the sake of being present with it, because we can't ultimately integrate it all.
And quite often ego is seen just as a negative thing. So I quite like this idea that, it's not just being full of yourself or whatever. It's a much more depth to it than that.
Yeah, I think there's much more depth to it than that. But I think it's trying to teach us that the ego sort of operates, on this principle of wanting to sort of fortify itself and sort of define itself, create solidity in the world, and give it a sort of a sense of sort of abiding in the world as something stable. But because the ego does that, and because of the way it sort of wants to limit its experiences, it makes us susceptible to a very sort of fundamental distortion. And that is the distortion of seeing others as anything less than embodiments of that excessive, effulgent, sublime principle of nature.
Right.
Yeah, so we have, particular ideas about other people, which of course other people offer. We present ourselves in the world like, oh, what are you like? Like you tell me what you're like, and I tell you what I'm like, and then that we relate to each other through those ideas. But of course, what we really are is something infinitely more interesting and infinitely more complex than those ideas could ever capture, right? But if we fail to recognize that, if we fail to see each other like that, then we can easily sort of fall into all kinds of harmful power dynamics with each other.
And prejudice even.
Prejudices, yeah, exactly. Because I can have preconceptions about what you're like because of your racial profile or your gender or your socioeconomic status or whatever it might be, and those are just further iterations of this sort of reductive function of the mind by which the mind tries to make sense of others, right? And when we're in the grip of that function of mind, we are fundamentally incapable of true intimacy, of really being present with the otherness of the other, with the full sort of like with everything about the other that doesn't fit comfortably inside the ideas that we use to mediate our perceptions of them, right? So if yoga's teaching us, I think yoga is teaching us to sort of open our consciousness to our shadow side, so open our consciousness to otherness within ourselves, to all of those thoughts and emotions and memories that we don't acknowledge because they don't cohere with our ideas about what we're really like or how we want to be known in the world. And so we sort of hold these things down, and when they show themselves, we usually just think of them as part of the background noise of our experience, or we don't acknowledge them at all. Because to acknowledge them is disorienting and threatening to our sense of who we are. But if so, there's this idea that what the yoga is trying to teach us to do is have a consciousness that's more like the consciousness that Shiva has. You know, the nature of which is sort of elaborated in certain stories. Like the churning of the cosmic ocean, for example, is a great story about Shiva's compassion, which shows his sort of openness to all of the things that don't fit comfortably inside the presiding scheme of organization. So Shiva, for example, he always has with him this entourage of, they're called the ganas.
Right.
Ganas, they're like the attendants, the hosts, but they're ghosts and goblins and marginal beings. You know, these are beings that sort of don't fit into society anywhere.
It's like a posse, his own posse.
He's got a posse.
He's got a posse.
And they're bandits, you know. They're you know, they're not just yeah. So they're misfits, you know, and Shiva prefers the company of the misfits because he sees them as, you know, that, I mean, in a sense, they remind him of the sort of excess and so the sublimity of his beloved, who's Shakti. You know, they remind him of everything that doesn't fit comfortably inside of his idea of his beloved.
Uh-huh.
And it's precisely because of the way that we defy any attempt to be reduced by a concept that we have this sort of sublime nature, that there's something uncontrollable about humanity, about the other, because the other is never and will never be just your idea of what it is. And nature has that same sublimity. I mean, it's the same sublimity. It's just that sort of excess. And it's the reason that it's sublime is because it's actually threatening to the ego's idea of who it is, because that idea is a relational idea. It's my idea of how I relate to others is my idea of who I am. You know?
Yes.
So that idea is always sort of threatening.
You find your position in life relative to what you perceive
Relative
everybody
to
else's
others.
position is or whatever.
Right, exactly.
And so how can we, because it's quite easy to go through being a yoga practitioner or just doing asana and not inquire about much at all. So how can we foster and draw upon this idea of taking that sensation and being more inquisitive?
I think that, I mean, one thing that we can do, I mean, one place that this kind of practice of opening ourselves to our shadow sides does is that it's opening ourselves to our shadow sides creates within ourselves the conditions of true intimacy with what we are. And it's the same with other human beings. So, and we all have this deep, inherent longing for intimacy with others. Not just sexual intimacy, but just we want to know each other. Humanity wants to know itself, you know? And almost everything that it does is animated by that deep existential longing. We want to know ourselves, and we can't know ourselves just by retreating into our own consciousness, as the stories about Shiva's dysfunction in meditation so clearly illustrate. We have to know ourselves by relating to others in a way that's mediated by our ideas, but in a way that also recognizes that we're always so much more than what we think we are. And that the other is always so much more than any idea that we have about the... So we have this deep fundamental urge for intimacy with others. What stands in the way is our sort of rigid grasp of our ideas about ourselves and our sort of egocentric agendas. Like, I want I want something from you, I see you as an instrument for getting what I want, right? And if that's, in the context of sexual intimacy, that's exceedingly pervasive, first of all.
Yeah.
Right? And I think we even think of consensual sexual intimacy as just being a matter of, I see you as having something that I want, you see me as having something that you want, and we agree to allow each other to get that thing from each other. But this is anybody who has sex based on that principle knows that it leaves you feeling desolate. That's not being in love. That's not the kind of sort of, the sort of tender exploration of the otherness of the other that two people who are sort of truly in love and willing to make themselves vulnerable can explore, right? So how do we create those conditions of intimacy so that our intimate relationships with one another don't have that sort of numbing desolation, right? But that they sort of open us up to the possibility of true intimacy. Well, it's just a matter of suspending our egocentric agendas and making space for the other to appear in all of her excess and her irreducibility and her unpredictability and her, to appear as something that really has nothing to do with my particular desires and ends and so forth. Holding space for each other.
Yeah.
That's the space of intimacy, and that's the space of Hatha Yoga. That's the space of practice in which we completely open ourselves to this profusion of sensation that's so much more than we can comprehend or make sense of, and we just allow it to unfold.
It's a part of that struck me from when you were talking just now is the non-judgmental of the self, but also of other people.
Right.
And that also happens a lot in the yoga practice too, or the physical yoga practice, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Judging yourself for
Everywhere.
being crap at this, or I was thinking that this morning actually, coming off of a month of not practicing being in freezing. I was like, oh, for God's sake, it's like turning the clock back 10 years. So it was going on right this morning. Yeah, for me, it was like, and the frustration, but also, as you say, you can then project that onto others too.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's just like totally natural. I think we all do it to some extent, most of the time. And so, compassion is not just sort of, real compassion, unconditional compassion is not just sort of immediate forgiveness, of our foibles and our, inadequacies and limitations and so forth. But it's something more than that. It's, compassion in this context, as it relates to Shiva, the kind of compassion that Shiva embodies is, well, look, the kind of compassion that Shiva embodies is really well elaborated in a particular story that Richard Freeman likes to tell, and I'm going to retell it here. It's one of the most popular myths of Indian mythology. It's very old. You can find it in the epic literature, in the Mahabharata, but also in so many other places. This myth is either told or referred to in various Puranas and so forth. So there's a time when the gods and demons they get together in order to they want to procure something called soma, which is this sort of milky white substance that gives them immortality, right? And connects them to a sense, connects their consciousness to the infinite. So I think they're selling this somewhere down on the beach too in Goa.
Probably.
But so the gods and demons are both into this, and so Vishnu tells them, well, you have the only way to get the soma, you have to distill it out of the cosmic ocean. So they get this serpent king named Vasuki, this giant snake, and they wrap him around a mountain, the largest mountain that they can find, which happens to be nearby. Has different names and different stories, but we can call it Mount Meru. And they coil it around the mountain 3.5 times, and then the gods take the tail of the serpent, and the demons take the head after much negotiation, and they start pulling and releasing in turn, so that this mountain is sort of spinning. And Vishnu incarnates as a turtle named Kurma, after whom Kurmasana is named, and he goes just underneath the surface of the water to hold the mountain up. So he's like the aponic support, okay? And the mountain is the spine. Mount Meru it's the name of the sort of central structure of the body in many Hatha Yoga texts. And Vasuki represents this sort of latent potential of consciousness to expand and evolve, or Kundalini, and it's coiled around the mountain 3.5 times, which of course to represent this each place where it then crosses is one of the 7 sort of psychical centers that we sometimes refer to as the chakras. So, and then the gods and demons represent the parts of ourselves that we're really anxious to identify with. The gods, they're just a reflection of the ego, and the demons, which are the parts of ourselves that maybe we identify with them a little bit, but mostly we try to sort of dissociate ourselves from. Our relationship is with them is a little bit more complicated, but they're both reflections of the ego, and they both demonstrate qualities that are sort of that are characteristic of the ego, like envy, jealousy. They both want recognition, and they both get upset they both get sort of resentful when they're not recognized, and etc. So anyways, they're churning the cosmic ocean, and at first the water glistens, and there's nice melodies coming up from the surface, and this of course is your first experience of yoga class.
I can't remember nice melodies. I think I can remember, oh my God, how can I not hold down dog for 5 breaths?
Yeah. My first experience was a little more like that too, but for some people it's nice in the beginning. But then they keep churning, and then all these weird sea creatures start coming up to the surface of the water. And they're kind of frustrated, and they're like, what are you doing? They're like, get out of here. And they kind of recognize these things, they've seen them before. They recognize them as sort of creatures of the deep, but they're getting in the way. They don't want them here, so they're pushing them out of the way, and then they keep churning. And then the creatures start getting more grotesque and sort of kind of unnerving and not even always recognizable. Like some of these creatures are coming to the surface, and they're like, what's that? And even these sort of darker parts of the ego are feeling threatened by these creatures that are coming up. So the gods and demons are starting to lose their nerve. Vishnu is sort of goading them on, reminding them that this is the only way that they can get the soma out of the cosmic ocean. Just as they're about to abandon their work, this thick putrid sludge comes up to the surface of the water, and they drop Vasuki, the serpent, and they all run to the shore. And there are great Indian paintings, classical Indian paintings of this particular mythological scene where you can see gods and demons throwing up and rolling around on the beach and stuff. They're so disgusted at this thick black sludge that's just filled the surface of the ocean. So it's a supreme environmental disaster. And now they don't know what to do. The whole ocean is just black, and it smells so bad no one will go near it. So they're looking at Vishnu, and Vishnu even is at a loss for what to do. So he calls his friend Shiva, who's up on the mountain, and so Shiva immediately comes down, and the gods and demons are they're I mean, they're mesmerized by I mean, Shiva is one of the gods that many of the demons worship. Many of them are devotees of Shiva, you know, because Shiva doesn't disparage them, for one thing. So he comes down and he's so magnificent. Everyone, they're sort of averting their eyes, but they're taking little stolen glances and noticing that his ganas, his entourage, bear a striking resemblance to those creatures that were coming up in the water just before the oil spill. So Shiva goes down and he scoops this sludge off the surface of the water and he lifts it up to his face and he takes a big whiff of it, and then he slurps it into his mouth to the astonishment of everyone present. And he doesn't swallow the poison, but he lets it slide across his soft palate so that he's like savoring the taste of the poison, and then he lets it settle in his throat, which then turns bright blue as the poison neutralizes. Yeah? And so Shiva is sometimes called Nilakanta, which means the blue-throated one, because of this. Because he drinks poison and then it turns his throat bright blue. So the cosmic ocean is totally clear now, and the gods and demons rush back into the water cheering, and they, coil Vasuki around the mountain again and quickly start churning. They're super excited.
They have another go?
Yeah, they're having another go at it. And, to make, and so then other sorts of figures and celestial beings start to appear, and many of them representing different forms of insight and of knowledge, including like different Vedic sciences and so forth. But finally, Sri Lakshmi arises from the water and blinds everyone with her magnificence, and she has a big earthen jug, and she pours the white soma out all over and just intoxicates everyone. And
nice.
Yeah, so the soma, the soma is like the release of nectar in Hatha Yoga that happens after Kundalini rises. So Kundalini is, and so the churning, of course, is a metaphor for yoga practice. And the idea is that the churning has to involve this sort of continuous this dynamic relationship between opposites, between the different parts of ourselves that sort of seem to be at odds but depend on one another for their identity. And we sort of churn our minds, and what happens is, at first maybe it's pleasant and it's lovely and it feels nice, but then we start to reveal our shadow sides. And so, these sort of things these sort of unresolved conflicts start presenting themselves in our consciousness, And the ego, of course, wants to just push those things back down, get them out of the way, right? And if those things become really difficult to bear, if they become really grotesque, the ego just wants to give up, stop practicing, come out of that back bend, take a break from yoga, whatever it is. But the idea is that it just gets worse. That if you really open yourself to your shadow side, then what comes up is stuff that you don't even realize is there. That you haven't even, it's not even stuff that you've sort of started to relate to but pushed back down. But it's something sort of deeper and more toxic than that. Yeah? And that's the sludge that comes up, and it's called in those stories, it's called hala hala. It's the hala hala of, that's referenced in the Ashtanga chant.
Yeah.
It's the poison of conditioned existence. It's the delusion in its various forms that gives us our sense of existential isolation from one another. Yeah. And the idea is that the soma is what liberates us from that delusion. It's the solvent of delusion. It's the thing that allows us to it's the thing that exposes us to our existential continuity with all other beings, and so dissolves our sense of isolation. And so in dissolving that sense of isolation, dissolves all of our egocentric anxieties and fears. But the story is telling us that we can't get from the hala hala to the soma without the intercession of a certain kind of consciousness, right? A consciousness that is completely embracing of the hala hala and is willing to drink it in and savor it, to taste it. A consciousness that doesn't even see the hala hala as something repulsive. So it's not forgiving the hala hala for being nasty. It's just like, oh wow, look at that. Like it, and so the idea is that we, in trying to embody this sort of deeply compassionate Shiva consciousness, we see the ego function as something infinitely fascinating. We take an interest in it. We don't try to deny the ego function. We don't try to struggle against it. We see it as one of the organizing principles of humanity, and so as something sacred and beautiful. And we completely embrace it, and all of the sort of toxicity that goes along with it. And in the sort of openness of that embrace, in the sort of willingness to be fully intimate with that toxicity, it turns to something else. It dissolves. You know, it becomes insight, and then the nectar rains down.
Rains down.
Yeah. And in Hatha Yoga, the nectar is said to lie just above the soft palate, and when Kundalini rises and burns through the different sort of tangles of our conditioning, she's sort of burning through these different sort of psychical delusions that we have at different levels of consciousness that isolate us from other beings. When she reaches the head, which is the abode of Shiva, this is just Shakti unfolding in the open space of Shiva, she melts the disk of the moon, and this nectar rains down and floods the senses with an unspeakable ecstasy. And that ecstasy is just perfect openness to reality. It's an openness to, it's a receptivity to the perfect continuity of all beings, to the perfect continuity of your being with all others, and that just is compassion.
But it's a lot easier to talk about being accepting of your darker side or that black sludge that's coming up than actually doing it.
Yeah.
So how do we go about that using yogic techniques, shall we say?
Yeah. Well, I think there's no substitute for sincerity and intention. That you have to sort of really, there's a part of us that longs for that kind of experience, and there's a part of us that understands that the ego is sort of in some way limiting and preventing us from having that experience, but that we also have to sort of work with it in order to proceed, in order to carry on. But then, and it's because of that inherent understanding, I think, that those of us who are drawn to yoga are drawn to yoga, and it can draw you to other things as well. But it's certainly that basic longing to touch the infinite, to touch the sublime, that gives yoga its allure and its promise. And so we just have to trust that we're being guided by that, and sort of use our intuition, and then I think start to understand how these techniques of yoga, of breathing and moving rhythmically, are supposed to help cultivate that kind of consciousness. And something like Ashtanga Vinyasa. So Ashtanga Vinyasa as I understand it, is very much about balancing these two energies of prana and apana. And prana and apana are they're sort of patterns of movement that represent the most elemental processes of life. They regulate, so prana and apana represent, at the most abstract level, expansion and contraction. So they govern in the physical body inhalation and exhalation, but also just taking things in through the senses, releasing things back out, taking in food, releasing food back out. Our basic sort of relationship of giving and of taking and receiving, and then of sort of giving back out to the environment, which is something that every living being does. You know, life emerges from that kind of interaction. And the mind itself works, of course, on the same principle of, our thought processes, the movement of the conceptual mind is a sort of continual oscillation between this sort of diversification of thought, the imagination of possibilities, the sort of drawing of consequences and that allows us to sort of grasp interrelationships of ideas, and then with the sort of aponic movement that dissolves all of the excess so that we can just focus on that one thing that's relevant. And you know, as we talk or as we listen or as we talk to ourselves or entertain thoughts in our own minds, our thoughts are following that very motion. There's a thought branches out. We have a certain idea about what's relevant. We follow a particular stream of thought, and then apana comes and dissolves the rest. And then that thought again branches out through prana. Then the apana comes and dissolves the rest. And so that gives us this sort of linear, discursive, narrative voice that we associate with ourselves, with our own voice. And that's the voice that's continuously making sense of our experience. So the Hatha Yoga practices try to, first they try to sort of liberate the various sort of psychophysical blockages to these patterns. We want prana to sort of be able to move through the body more freely. And it doesn't move through the body freely in a way that reflects the way that our perceptions of the world are sort of limited and confined by our ideas and our unresolved conflicts and our, what in yoga philosophy is called our samskaras. So it's sort of limited in that way, and by sort of breathing and moving our bodies, we're inviting the prana to move outside of those conditioned patterns in a way that will be reflected in an ability to sort of have a shift of perspective on our own experience. But then beyond that, when you get into like a slightly more sophisticated level of the practice, which is no less fundamental, and you start to work with things like bandha and mudra, internal mudra, the pressing together of these energies of prana and apana. The idea is that you're trying to get the energy of expansion and contraction, of creativity and dissolution, to simultaneously manifest, to simultaneously activate. And so then what would that mean? It would mean, for example, this technique of Mula bandha, of holding tone in the pelvic floor. What does that have to do with meditative consciousness? Well, the pelvic floor naturally contracts every time you exhale. That's physiologically, that's one of the sort of central expressions of the exhale pattern. And there's a sort of gathering and dropping of sensation toward the pelvic floor if you pay attention to that, right? So if we work with Mula bandha as this idea of sort of holding that tone, that exhale pattern, that sort of central node of the exhale pattern, and holding our attention there, the idea is that we keep the dissolving power of apana active even as we inhale, right? And so then sensation and thought is free to manifest and to sort of branch out through our consciousness, but in a way that we maintain a certain kind of detachment to it, you know? So then instead of being distracted just by one particular thought form, we sort of, that whole idea of relevance is sort of suspended because apana is just being held fixed. So in other words, we're staying grounded in the present moment, even as our minds sort of branch out, and there are all these sort of imaginings and these you know, we're having this very manifold experience in the asana. Like, it feels good. Does it feel good, or does it hurt? Is it good pain? Is it bad pain? Is it scary? Is it comforting? You know, sometimes it can be all of that. It's all of that at the same time. It just depends where you're turning your attention.
Yeah.
And the idea is not to grab a hold of any of it, you know, but to let all of it unfold in the space of your awareness. So the continual activation of the apana pattern, that idea of sort of staying bound to the root, of holding Mula bandha, of keeping the dissolving force of the mind active even as the chitta vrittis unfold, is what allows for this state of nirodha, for this state of the suspension of the activity of the mind by which we keep grasping a hold of a particular thought current and then being distracted out of the present moment by that ride. Yeah.
And in your own personal journey, is there certain aspects of it that you've really struggled with or still struggle with?
Oh yeah. Certain aspects of it that I really struggle with. I mean, I struggle with you know, with being a human being, and with self-enclosure. Yeah, with taking myself too seriously, with being, you know, caught up in my own trip, and that can take lots of different manifestations. But since you're recording this, maybe I'll just leave it abstract like that.
I thought we were talking juicy. So when we're trying to relate to ourselves, really, aren't we, and use that as a vehicle to relate to others,
Yeah.
with the practice that we're doing.
Oh, well said.
Do we need to not just do asana? Do we need to think more of the more traditional eightfold path? And how do we draw upon those other aspects? Could you maybe give us a little summary of the eightfold path and what it means and where our practice sits within it?
Sure, yeah. I mean, well, let me start with this metaphor of, you know, I think that what we need to do is draw those practices in, because that's the idea behind Ashtanga Vinyasa, that Ashtanga Vinyasa is not just an asana practice. It's not even designed to be. It's a practice that combines the, you know, the fundamental practices of Hatha Yoga. So we have, you know, asana, of course, but also pranayama. It's fundamentally a breathing practice. You know, the breath is what guides us through the movements. It's what brings us in and out of the postures. And the postures are just so many ways of giving expression to those breathing patterns, and so allowing us to really sort of explore those breathing patterns on the level of sensation and to explore their inner fusion, you know. And that practice of course takes great concentration, or dharana, right? And if we're sort of really get sort of if the attention really gets drawn in to the experience of breath, if it really gets riveted into that, you know, then it becomes quite naturally, you know, an instance of dhyana, or a sort of, which is just sort of like a very sustained, steady, you know, deep sort of movement of awareness into the present moment. And of course, Oh, and pratyahara is a sort of, pratyahara is like the suspension of our tendency to get distracted by the activation of the senses, by the movement of the senses, by what passes through our sensory field. That one's probably the most often misunderstood. It doesn't mean, because it's sometimes the formula that's usually given in English is like withdrawal from the senses.
Yeah, or one pointed concentration or something like that.
Yeah, and then you kind of have this idea that that in pratyahara you're like tuning out the world, so that the sounds around that, the sounds of the birds here in the jungle are suddenly supposed to be irrelevant to what you're doing, or something that you're supposed to kind of withdraw away from that. But the way I understand it is that the pratyahara doesn't mean that. It simply means that you experience those sensory stimulations as pure sensation rather than as attaching a story to them.
Mm-hmm.
So you become more present rather than less present with them, because you actually see them for what they are. You don't take it and think like, oh, that's a particular jungle bird called so-and-so, and start to get all like heady about it, like putting it into a biological category and having thoughts about its migratory pattern and stuff, right? But it's that sound of the bird chirping, you sort of feel it move through your consciousness as a sort of pure sensory experience, and one that illuminates the sort of continuity between the inner space of your mind and the environment all around the shala, that there's a sort of seamless flow, of the vibration of that other living being and what you're immediately experiencing. And so it's a sort of revelation of your continuity with that being, rather than, it has nothing to do with shutting it out, but when we suspend the discursive activity of the mind, when we suspend that part of our mind that's trying to limit our experiences continuously, and instead we just open up the mind, so that we open up our awareness to all of our sensory fields and to everything that's happening all at the same time, which we can't. You can't make sense of that. It's always more than you can comprehend. But pratyahara is precisely that, is opening ourselves up to that. And then if we're focusing on it, we have the dharana. If the focus becomes sort of riveted, then it moves into, the two highest stages of the yoga, the dhyana, and samadhi just means that you become completely absorbed in that experience. And I do think that, samadhi is definitely something that can happen while, there are many, many forms of samadhi, but samadhi is definitely something that you can do while the body's moving. You can have samadhi on the moving body. But there's also, the very best part of the Ashtanga practice is like the very end, right after Shiva. I kind of think it's all the best part, but I don't really have a favorite part. I really like the beginning, and then everything in the middle, and the end stuff too, and then it's over. But when it's over, I think it's a real shame to see people finish yoga and then like run out the door into the world.
Yeah.
Because there's so much to see. It just gets better and better as the practice unfolds, and then the closing sequence, is designed to sort of rebalance. Most of the Ashtanga sequence, you're sort of drawing sensation in toward the center line and pulling it up through the central axis of the body, sort of reiterating this very basic, alchemical process that the Hatha Yoga texts describe as the raising of Kundalini. You're reiterating that with sensation. You're sort of creating you're retracing that very movement through the body with breath and sensation all the way through the practice. And the more you do that, the more, and you sort of move and breathe, the more your experience of the body opens up. So toward the end of the practice, there's this, the body's just humming. you know, in a way that you can't. There's just so much sensation. It's such an outpouring of sensation, and then we can sit with that, and it's just sheer joy, you know, to just sit with that at the end of a practice, and then to be absorbed in that, you know, and that's the practice of samadhi. If you're sort of truly absorbed in that, and it's, I mean, one thing that Patanjali really warns against in the Yoga Sutra is practicing samadhi on tamasic states of mind. So on states of mind that are sort of dull, stuck. And I think that warning is not maybe heeded so well in popular yoga culture, where this idea of sort of disciplining yourself to sit is a very pervasive idea. And so, I mean, at least from my perception, I see from the outside that it happens a lot, that people kind of like, you know, discipline themselves to sort of sit with themselves when they're not in a particularly inspiring state of mind.
Yeah, yeah.
You know, and that can create more rather than less neurosis. It can pull someone into greater self-enclosure and greater self-absorption, greater sort of, you know, it can tangle you deeper into your psyche rather than drawing you out of it. The Ashtanga Vinyasa practice is an amazing resource for sort of breaking us up, for pulling us out of that.
Yeah.
You know, and so when we finish the practice, and I mean, if we've practiced with a sort of light-hearted attitude, with a sense of humor, with a compassionate consciousness, and just with a sort of willingness to embrace and to appreciate and to admire everything that we're experiencing, then by the end, it's delightful. We're in quite an open, receptive state of mind. And then to just sit and be present with that, or just lie there or whatever, and allow ourselves to be fully absorbed in that experience of receptivity, that's good practice.
And as
That's
you say,
good
you can
yoga.
easily rush on by that, can't you, if
Easily
you're not
rush
very
on by
careful.
that, yeah. It's
And
not to be missed.
Not to be missed. And you've obviously got a deep connection to Shiva Shakti, but are there other sort of texts or other sections of texts that you've found through your own journey that you've drawn on greatly, that you relate to everyday life, or that means particular things to you?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the best yoga texts are sort of older ones.
Mm-hmm.
I really like the Shiva Samhita and the Aparokshanubhuti by Shankaracharya. That's a brilliant, beautiful, very lyrical sort of and sort of devotional work. I really like those. And then I really like a lot of literature that's outside of yoga, the yoga tradition at all. So I read pretty widely and get really excited when I find an author or a writing or some piece of work that seems to be speaking with great insight about what I recognize as yogic experience, and yet this person maybe has no concept of what that word yoga actually means, or what this tradition is like, and so it's sort of a revelation of the sort of universality of the archetypal nature of these sort of experiences of ecstasy and of openness and receptivity and intimacy. So I always really enjoy that. Yeah.
Thanks so much, Ty, for sharing this week. This is not the last thing we're doing with you, is it? We're going to do a little bit some workshops tomorrow.
Yes.
And so, but just great to hear you talk. And of
Thanks
course,
so much.
thanks so much.